When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Russians called it denazification. The cities of Kharkiv and Chernihiv were shelled and bombed in the name of demilitarization. The city of Mariupol was being leveled in the name of liberation. The civilized world used the words war, invasion, and occupation. Then, at the very beginning of April, Russian forces retreated from the Kyiv region. The atrocity that the media dubbed the Bucha massacre was unveiled. Hundreds of civilians executed, often with their hands tied behind their backs. In Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, Motyzhin, Makariv, and other towns and villages in the Kyiv region caused the word genocide resonate around the world. One of the first political leaders to use it was the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
I'm afraid when you look at what's happening in Bucha, the revelations that we're seeing from what Putin has done in Ukraine, which, you know, doesn't look far short of genocide to me.
Then came the US President Joe Biden.
President Biden is now flat out accusing Vladimir Putin of committing genocide in Ukraine.
Yes, I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian.
And a bit more cautiously, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau.
I think it's absolutely right that more and more people be talking and using the word genocide in terms of what Russia is doing, what Vladimir Putin has done.
Not only Western leaders use the word. The President of Colombia, Ivan Duque, did too.
Richard, I think we all have to call things by its name, and what's happening in Ukraine is a genocide. This brutal genocide has to come to an end.
The first parliament to use the word genocide in regards to Russian war crimes in Ukraine was the same of Poland on the 7th of April.
Przemoc stosowana rozmyślnie i systematycznie przez wojska Federacji Rosyjskiej wobec cywilnych obywateli i obywatelek Ukrainy nosi znamiona ludobójstwa.
Other parliaments followed, in Ukraine itself, then in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and in Canada.
The House recognized that the Russian Federation is committing acts of genocide against the Ukrainian people.
At a glance, it seems quite obvious to use the term. Mass executions near Kyiv, filtration camps near Mariupol, deporting of Ukrainian children from occupied territories. Yet not everyone agrees, some for reasons that have nothing to do with the meaning of the word genocide itself. French President Emmanuel Macron, for instance, is reluctant to use the word genocide not for substantial reasons. He just thinks it would mean France would be obliged to intervene in Ukraine if there was a genocide, and he wouldn't want that.
Et j'attire l'attention de tout le monde. Si c'est un génocide, les États qui considèrent que c'est un génocide se doivent, par les conventions internationales, d'intervenir. Est-ce que c'est ce que les gens souhaitent? Je ne crois pas.
Scholars are also a bit divided. While some genocide researchers firmly believe that we are witnessing a genocide in Ukraine, some others are more cautious. What kind of problem is there with the qualification? What other evidence, aside from the mass killings of civilians, is there to prove Russian genocidal intent? What would be the repercussions, and why is it so important to know if there is genocide, in terms of accountability, international law, in history itself? To answer these questions, we have talked to three scholars. A Holocaust researcher, Eugene Finkel from Johns Hopkins University in Washington, US. In early April, he published an op-ed in the Washington Post insisting Russia was committing genocide. A genocide and atrocity crimes researcher, Jonathan Leader Maynard from the King's College in London. He has published an article advocating a more cautious approach to the use of the term genocide in regards to Ukraine. And to give our investigation a proper Ukrainian perspective, a Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, who has recently published his own view on a possible genocide in Ukraine. But this won't be a purely theoretical study. We will show you some pretty chilling examples of Russian state propaganda.
Эту идею надо стереть от начала до конца. На 100 лет отравляет жизнь народам.
We will quote Vladimir Putin's declaration of war.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
We will listen to some phone calls by Russian soldiers intercepted by the security service of Ukraine.
Как мы между собой общаемся, говорят, надо всех убивать, и детей, и женщин, и всех подряд.
Кто сказал?
Неважно, что сказал. Всех надо убивать, всю Украину надо вытравить просто.
And we will read from a real Russian genocide handbook, as the historian Timothy Snyder put it, one of the most openly genocidal documents ever. All this to answer the question, is Russia really committing genocide in Ukraine? To even start to understand if Russians are really committing genocide in Ukraine, we first have to understand what the term genocide really means. There's this common idea that the term genocide, or the crime of crimes, as it is referred to in one of the judgments by the International Criminal Court, defines a massacre of the scale of the Holocaust or the genocide in Rwanda. That isn't so. The UN Convention, with the long official name, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The acts include killing members of the group, but also causing them serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting unsurvivable conditions, preventing birth, and forcibly transferring children to another group.
Theory, you can have a genocide without anyone being actually killed. Not that it happens in practice, but the legal term or the legal definition does not require large numbers of victims. It might not even require any killings being done at all.
This, even considering that the term genocide in the UN Convention has lost a lot of its original meaning. The term itself was invented by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who had been a student at the Lviv University in today's Ukraine. His original concept of genocide was a lot broader.
Він включав цю концепцію злочин не тільки проти релігійних, етнічних чи національних груп, а також груп політичних і культурних. Це, кстати, сталося те, що була це прийнята обкроєна варіант позначення геноциду, і Лемкін на неї пішов, тому що Лемкін вважав, що краще така редакція, ніж відсутність будь-якої версії.
Other scholars agree. Raphael Lemkin would undoubtedly qualify Russian war crimes in Ukraine as a genocide. But his original conception only partially made it to the UN Convention, and with an emphasis on intent. And that is the problem when we are looking at the mass executions in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine.
To be confident in saying that those attacks constitute genocide, we need to know that the genocidal motive, as it were, is the overriding one. That the principal reason why civilians are being targeted, or at least a major reason why civilians are being targeted, is part of a systematic attempt to wipe out those civilians as a group.
Proving genocidal intent is not easy, but not impossible. Russian state media decided to help. Just a few days after the world saw the atrocities in Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, and elsewhere in Ukraine, the Russian state-controlled media RIA Novosti published an article titled "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" Historian Timothy Snyder, one of the most renowned researchers in the field of mass killings, called this piece a genocide handbook and wrote that it was one of the most openly genocidal documents he has ever seen. What does it say? Well, let's see a few quotes. Note, Nazi in those quotes would simply mean Ukrainian patriot in normal language, but you'll understand that yourself. Besides the highest ranks, a significant number of common people are also guilty of being passive Nazis and Nazi accomplices. They supported the Nazi authorities and pandered to them. A just punishment for this part of the population can only be possible through bearing the inevitable hardships of a just war against the Nazi system. Apparently, the name Ukraine cannot be kept as the title of any fully denazified state entity on the territory liberated from the Nazi regime. Denazification will inevitably include de-Ukrainization, the rejection of the large-scale artificial inflation of the ethnic component in the self-identification of the population of the historical Malorossia and Novorossiya territories. This article was one of the central points of Eugene Finkel's op-ed in the Washington Post, when he insisted that a genocide was indeed happening in Ukraine.
We're not talking about just regime change or government change. We're talking about completely destroying the idea of who Ukrainians are and what Ukraine is beyond state institutions. So I certainly do see an intent here.
Even Jonathan leader Maynard, much more cautious about using the term genocide in regards to Russian war crimes in Ukraine, agrees Russian media are clearly genocidal.
We probably wouldn't be having the conversation at this point were it not for the rhetoric that is coming out from Russian politicians, elites, and kind of what we know is officially state-sanctioned media. The rhetoric from the Russian side is very clearly genocidal.
Yes, the generalization is quite justified. The article we quoted earlier is not an isolated case. To give you some more angles of the genocidal rhetoric in Russian state media during the war, here's a few examples collected and subtitled by the Russian Media Monitor Project and others.
Вот что, кстати, говорит по этому поводу Виктория Нуль. Она когда говорит, что, мол, геноцид Владимир Путин устраивает, так она конкретно говорит, видно же, в чем цель Путина – стереть идею быть украинцем. Так я с Викой Нулом согласен. Вика, ты гений. Эту идею надо стереть от начала до конца. Она 100 лет отравляет жизнь народам.
И четко можно сегодня уже прогнозировать, что нам придется быть на Украине 30-40 лет. Когда два поколения поменяем, эту заразу с корнем оттуда, а потом уже будем разбираться.
Итого мы получим максимум 5% неизлечимых. В простом выражении 2 миллиона человек. Вот эти вот 2 миллиона человек должны были либо уехать с Украины, либо должны быть денацифицированы. То есть быть уничтожены. Не больше.
Senior Russian officials themselves aren't shying away from the genocidal talk. Dmitry Medvedev, who once acted as a Russian president, contributed to the genocidal handbook just 2 days after it was published, stating that Ukrainian history and nation were fake.
Deep Ukrainism, nurtured by anti-Russian poison and an all-encompassing lie about its identity that is one big fake, to change the bloody consciousness of a part of today's Ukrainians, full of deceitful myths, is a goal of utmost importance.
The actual Russian president, Vladimir Putin, in his de facto declaration of war on Ukraine, denied Ukraine's history and pictured it as an artificial state.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией. Точнее, большевистской, коммунистической Россией. В результате большевистской политики и возникла советская Украина, которую и в наши дни можно с полным основанием назвать Украина имени Владимира Ильича Ленина. Он ее автор и архитектор.
The Ukrainian identity itself, Putin claimed, was based on a lie about being a nation distinct from Russia.
Украинские власти изначально, хочу это подчеркнуть, именно с первых шагов стали строить свою государственность на отрицании всего, что нас объединяет. Стремились исковеркать сознание, историческую память миллионов людей, целых поколений, живущих на Украине.
So, there's a clearly genocidal rhetoric in Russian state-controlled media backed by the highest-ranking Russian officials. Is this not enough to conclude that the atrocities committed by the Russian army in Ukraine were driven by a genocidal motive and therefore constitute a genocide? Not necessarily.
We have clear atrocities on the ground, we have genocidal rhetoric. What isn't completely clear at the moment is the extent to which those two things are connected.
Even Eugene Finkel agrees with that.
That, I agree, is the missing part, and that's where the argument is about. Because people who still don't think that this is genocide, they need evidence, they won't see evidence exactly on that point.
There is a way to trace a connection between the Russian state propaganda and the Russian military on the ground. In July last year, Vladimir Putin published a big article about Ukraine with more or less the same ideas that the ones we just quoted. It has been reported by Russian media that the article was made mandatory reading for Russian soldiers upon its publication, by the order of the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. But such a connection would rather be shaky, so what kind of evidence should we be looking for?
One would be evidence of the exact orders that have been given to military forces, or expressions of intent or motive by those forces themselves.
The evidence that the Russian soldiers themselves were driven by genocidal reasoning isn't easy to find. There were some pretty good indications, though. One particular story comes to mind. According to the Ukrainian Ombudsman for Human Rights, Lyudmila Denisova, there were cases of rape in Bucha with genocidal motives.
About 25 girls and women aged 14 to 24 were systematically raped during the occupation in the basement of one house in Bucha. 9 of them are pregnant. Russian soldiers told them they would rape them to the point where they wouldn't want sexual contact with any man to prevent them from having Ukrainian children.
A rape with the intent to prevent a Ukrainian woman from ever having a Ukrainian child or to make her give birth to a Russian child is a genocidal rape. But critics could dismiss this particular story as hearsay. So how do we obtain declarations of intent from the Russian soldiers themselves? As unlikely as it may seem, there is a way. From the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian security service has been intercepting Russian soldiers' phone calls, as the Russians often use unsecured mobile connection and sometimes even stolen Ukrainian SIM cards. They've been publishing dozens of fragments of these phone calls, and we have listened to them with a particular focus on detecting genocidal intent, and we have found quite a lot. For this investigation, we have chosen 4 fragments, but there is a lot more. First fragment. A Russian soldier identified as Valery Babayev calls home and says a little girl, most likely his little sister, sent him a letter asking to kill all the Ukrainians.
Слышишь, что? Короче, Лизе сказали, там, в школе там гуманитарку собирали.
Ага.
Лиза положила мне носки и письмо написала.
Да.
Бабаев Валерий. Пишет тебе Бабаева Елизавета. Прошу тебя, чтобы быстрее убивай всех украинцев и приезжай домой.
Поскорее что это?
Убивай всех украинцев и приезжай домой. Мама говорит, я говорит, офигела.
Правильно, ребенок все по факту сказал.
Ну да.
Second fragment. A Russian soldier calls his mother and tells her they are killing civilians in Ukraine, even children. His mother replies, "No, you're not. You're killing fascists."
Ты знаешь, вы делаете великое дело. Вот это запомни и всем передай.
Что мы делаем? Убиваем гражданских детей, блин?
Нет, вы не убиваете гражданских детей. Вы фашистов убиваете, блядь, поверьте тоже. Все, прекрати, не надо.
The next fragment is pretty similar. A soldier is calling home and says that his co-serviceman saw a mother walking by with 2 kids and killed the mother in front of the kids. A woman on the other side of the phone replies, well, of course, she's the enemy too.
Шла вон мать с 2 детьми. Ну и что, наши вальнули ее при детях. Завалили.
Конечно. Она считается, конечно, тоже враг.
The last fragment, well, it doesn't really require an explanatory introduction. It's all there. The Russian soldier speaking is identified as Ivan Klimenko.
Мы между собой общаемся, говорит, надо всех убивать. И детей, и женщин, всех подряд.
Кто сказал?
Ну, неважно, кто сказал. Всех надо убивать. Всю Украину надо вытравить просто. До самого Львова.
Ну, планета...
Находится, все надо вытравить, чтобы этой страны вообще не было на карте земли соответственно.
So 4 different phone calls from 4 different soldiers with 4 different shades of genocidal intent. Kill them all, they're all fascists and enemies to kill, and exterminate them. That's quite a philosophy, endorsed and nurtured by the Russian state itself, it would seem. In mid-April, Vladimir Putin rewarded the 64th Brigade, the brigade allegedly responsible for the worst atrocities in Bucha. But genocide does not necessarily mean kill them all or exterminate them. Remember how the UN Convention defines genocide as acts with intent to destroy a group as a whole or in part? There's an explanation to it. A genocide may be directed at destroying not an entire ethnicity, but at destroying a nation. There's a difference.
Що можна старатися не винищити народ, завжди це неможливо, але можна знищити ту групу, яка перетворює етнічну культуру національну. Хто це є? Переважно це є митці, це є політичні діячі, журналісти, всі ті, що ми називаємо, знаєте, культурною чи політичною елітою. Тому дуже часто геноцид зводиться, знаєш, не до знищення всієї групи, скажімо, як Гітлер думав про євреїв чи циган, а знищення тої групи, яка є носієм і творцем національної культури.
Eliminating the elites instead of killing everyone indiscriminately falls perfectly into the genocidal framework. There are indications that Russians were, at least some of the time, following such an approach. The mayor of Bucha recalled that the Russian soldiers had specific kill lists.
Це не просто вбивство заради вбивства. А вони цілеспрямовано це робили, тому що в них були списки, я бачив ті списки віддруковані, не власноручно написані, що хтось із, можливо, місцевих десь надиктував, якісь колаборації, можливо, були. А вони підготовлені, вони віддруковані, тобто вони заздалегідь знали, куди вони йдуть, на яку адресу і до кого, і що це за людина.
This testimony is not really unexpected. 1 week before the Russian full-scale invasion, the US State Secretary Antony Blinken warned the UN Security Council about Russia having such plans.
And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians.
A few days before the Russian invasion, the US representative to the UN office wrote a letter to further stress this point. We have credible information that indicates Russian forces are creating lists of identified Ukrainians to be killed or sent to camps following a military occupation, he wrote. These lists allegedly included journalists, activists, and generally those who oppose Russian actions. Such a selective approach aimed at eliminating the elites may be even more indicative of a genocide than the mass killings, according to historian and political scientist Klaus Bachmann.
To answer if Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, more important than mass graves are the attacks on the Ukrainian government, attempts to kill Zelensky, missile attacks on administrative buildings, and deportation of civilians into the depths of Russia with the aim of Russification.
Let's say you are convinced now. You see the genocidal logic, you see the system. You know about the mass killings, filtration camps, child deportations, the genocidal rhetoric in the Russian state media, and you know about the rhetoric of the Russian soldiers on the intercepted phone calls, plus the plans to eliminate the Ukrainian national elites. What then? Is the French President Emmanuel Macron right and the world is bound by international conventions to intervene? On one hand, the answer is not really.
There is indeed a perception that, genocide requires intervention. That's not correct. Legally, what the convention does require is preventing genocide, and I think we already passed that point, and punishing perpetrators.
On the other hand, in terms of obligations in the international law, it doesn't even really matter if it's a genocide or just crimes against humanity.
There is a strong norm in international politics that you need to act to prevent atrocity crimes, whether they're genocide or not, right? So even if we made the judgment of what's going on here is massive crimes against humanity, that doesn't let the international community off the hook, right? They should be doing a lot more to try and prevent those crimes.
Of course, using the term genocide, the crime of crimes, puts more political pressure on the international community to do more. But for Ukraine, it's not only and not even mainly about that.
I think it's very important. I think it's very important for moral reasons. I think it's very important for accountability reasons. Building the case for accountability, not just the criminal accountability of the perpetrators, but also broader historical accountability.
A Ukrainian scholar may offer such a broader perspective on why it is important for Ukraine after what Ukraine went through in the 20th century.
Тут рівень насильства був екстремальним, особливо між 14-45 роком. Тому, приймаючи концепцію геноциду, називаючи явище українського геноциду, ми не тільки, скріплюємо віру в справедливість світову, поборюємо зло, чи обмежуємо насильство. Ми також ще звертаємо увагу, що Україна є одною з центральних територій, де це насильство застосовувалося. Тому тут це має бути припинено особливо.
But of course, accountability matters too, and not only for the perpetrators themselves. under the UN Convention, the incitement to commit genocide is punishable too, and that would mean punishment for all those fine examples of Russian genocidal propaganda. If all those responsible are punished, it would be an important step to making the slogan "Never Again" meaningful again.